Imagine finding out that um, adding just one tiny word to your Bible, a word that literally doesn't exist in the ancient Greek text, completely alters the identity of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, it's a pretty massive thought experiment. I mean, especially when that single word shifts an entire theological framework.
Right, because if you've been studying the scriptures for decades, sitting in the congregation meetings week after week, you've internalized things deeply.
Oh, absolutely.
Like chapter 4 of the book, what does the Bible really teach? It lays down a very firm baseline.
It does. It teaches that Jesus is Jehovah's most precious, first created son, that he has a definitive beginning and was then used to create everything else.
Exactly. But what happens if we step back from our modern translations for a minute? What if we put the original Greek and Hebrew texts under the microscope?
Well, that's the mission for today. We're going to look at some really specific biblical arguments brought up in 2 videos from the YouTube channel Hilfe für Zeugen Jehovah's.
Right, and we're just analyzing their deep dive into the text. They contrast the well-known teachings of the Watchtower Society with alternative, strictly grammatical readings of the original languages.
Yeah, the goal is just to test these claims. We're looking at 8 biblical proofs and 4 counter-arguments about his nature. Did Jesus have a starting point, or is he eternal?
And to do that, we have to take off our usual theological lenses, right? We need to just look at how language, grammar, and historical context actually functioned back then.
Precisely. No assumptions, just the text.
So let's jump straight into the titles attributed to Jesus in prophecy and Revelation. Isaiah 9.6 is a huge anchor point here.
It really is. That's where the promised Messiah is called the Eternal Father.
Now, as someone who's read the Bible for over 20 years, I hear that and think, well, angels and faithful humans will live forever too, right?
Yeah, they will.
So why would this specific title point to an eternal nature rather than just him living forever into the future?
Because we have to differentiate between having eternal life in the future and actually carrying a title of eternity.
Okay, unpack that a little.
Well, angels were created, and yes, they will live forever. Humans are gifted eternal life. But if you look across the entire biblical canon, no angel, no prophet, nobody is ever given a title describing eternity as their core attribute.
Oh, wow. I never thought about it like that.
Yeah, that kind of title is traditionally and exclusively reserved for God in the Old Testament. So the argument here is that calling Christ Eternal Father implies he doesn't just receive eternity as a future gift.
He actually carries eternity in his own nature.
Exactly. It's inherent to who he is.
And if he carries eternity in his nature, that brings us right into Revelation, specifically those big titles like Alpha and Omega.
Right, the first and the last.
Now, we know the Watchtower Society applies the Alpha and Omega title in Revelation 21.6 to Jehovah, and that's widely accepted.
Yeah, no debate there.
But then we get to Revelation chapter 22, verse 13. The New World Translation implicitly assigns that verse to the Father as well, because the Alpha and Omega title shows up again.
But there's a serious contextual issue there, right?
A massive one. I mean, just look at the immediate context. In verse 12, the speaker says, "Look, I am coming quickly."
And in the New Testament, the one coming quickly is always Jesus.
Always. And if that wasn't clear enough, just 3 verses later in verse 16, the speaker literally identifies himself. He says, "I, Jesus, sent my angel to bear witness to you about these things for the congregations."
So the speaker before verse 13 is Jesus, and the speaker after verse 13 is explicitly Jesus.
Right. So I have to ask, if the text clearly identifies Jesus as the one talking, how can we just suddenly shift the speaker to the Father for one single verse?
You're hitting on a fundamental principle of reading comprehension. I mean, think about reading a letter from a friend. If right in the middle of a paragraph, your friend's dad suddenly inserts one sentence, but there's no grammatical marker, no quotation marks, no change in voice, the letter would make no sense.
It'd be totally disjointed.
Exactly. And the Greek text in Revelation 22 has absolutely no indicators of a speaker change. Shifting verse 13 to the Father breaks the logical flow of the text.
So if we keep the flow intact, Jesus is the Alpha and Omega in that context.
Right, which means before him there was no one, and after him there was no one, in terms of absolute existence.
That is fascinating, because this idea of origins gets even more complex when we look at the Hebrew scriptures. Let's look at Micah 5.2.
Ah, the Bethlehem prophecy.
Yeah, the one predicting the ruler coming out of Bethlehem. Now, the baseline teaching is that Jesus' origin was in the distant past, at the moment of his creation.
But the source video points out something really interesting in the original Hebrew there.
Right, the word for his origins, it's plural.
Yes, literally it translates to his goings forth, plural.
But wait, how can someone have plural origins? If he was created once, at a specific point in time, he'd only have one origin.
It sounds paradoxical until you realize origin doesn't have to mean the moment he was first manufactured.
Okay, so what does it mean then?
The linguistic analysis suggests these plural goings forth represent multiple appearances or actions of stepping out from eternity and into time.
Oh, like when he appeared as the angel of Jehovah in the Old Testament.
Exactly. He interacted with the patriarchs, he spoke to Moses, and then ultimately he went forth into the flesh in Bethlehem.
So these aren't starting points of his existence.
No, they're moments of him acting in human history, stepping out from an already existing eternity.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But it naturally leads to the next question.
Yeah.
Did Jesus actually know this? Did he ever talk about his own past like this when he was on earth?
That brings us right to that intense confrontation with the religious leaders in John 8:58.
Yeah, where he says, before Abraham came to be.
And the Watchtower Society translates the next part as, I have been, present perfect tense.
Right. Basically saying Abraham was born, but I was around before him.
But if that's all he meant, just that he was older than Abraham, why did the Pharisees immediately pick up stones to kill him?
Yeah. I mean, angels existed before Abraham, too. Claiming to be older than a patriarch isn't blasphemy under Jewish law. It certainly doesn't justify a public stoning.
Exactly. And the reason for their violent reaction is right there in the Greek. Jesus used the phrase ego eimi.
Which translates to, I am.
Right. It's a historical present tense. It points to a timeless, continuous existence. But more importantly, to a first-century Jewish audience, this wasn't a grammar lesson. It was a massive, neon-flashing quote.
Exodus 3:14, the burning bush.
Precisely. When God revealed his name to Moses, he said, I am that I am.
So when Jesus stood in the temple and dropped ego eimi on the religious leaders, they knew exactly what he was doing.
They knew he was claiming the sacred, eternal name of God for himself. He wasn't just saying he was really old.
He was saying, that eternal, uncreated existence of God, that's me.
Yes. And that's why the stones came out. To the Pharisees, claiming ontological equality with God sharing his actual essence was the ultimate blasphemy.
Sharing his essence. That phrase connects perfectly to our next text, John 16:27, and also chapter 17.
Where Jesus talks about coming from the Father.
Right. The New World Translation uses a very specific word here. It says, Jesus came as the Father's representative.
But the analysis of the Greek text argues the original wording is much more literal. It means he came out from the Father.
To really grasp why that difference matters, think about it like this. Compare an ambassador to a child.
Okay, I like where this is going.
An ambassador is sent by a foreign government. They are representative. They speak to the country, but they aren't made of the same substance as the country itself.
Right, they just have a functional role.
Exactly. Or think of an artist making a painting. The painting might represent the artist, but it doesn't share the artist's human DNA. It's created out of foreign materials, canvas, and paint.
But a child is totally different.
Right. When a father has a child, he doesn't build the child out of wood or clay. The child comes out from the father.
Sharing the exact same DNA.
Exactly. The same nature, the same substance. So as the Greek says Jesus came out from the Father, it means he's not an ambassador created out of nothing. He shares the Father's eternal, uncreated nature.
That's a brilliant analogy, and it captures exactly what the source material is arguing. It's not about a job title. It's about his actual nature.
Okay, so we've looked at some heavy arguments for his eternal nature. But we have to be completely objective here. We need to look at the counter-arguments.
Because there are definitely verses that seem to point toward Jesus being a created being.
Absolutely. If you're out in field service or studying, you know these verses by heart. Let's start with Colossians 1:15 through 17.
The classic text.
In the New World Translation, it says that by means of Jesus, all other things were created.
And this is where the source from the channel Hilfe for Zeugen Jehovah's really focuses on the grammar. If you look at the Greek interlinear, the word other simply isn't there.
It's totally missing.
Right. The Greek just says, all things were created through him.
Now, let me play devil's advocate for a second. Translators add words all the time. It's just part of making ancient languages readable in English.
True, they do.
So why is adding the word other such a big deal in this specific verse?
Because in this case, adding that word changes the logical category of the subject. If I say, he created all things, then logically the creator cannot be part of the things he created.
He stands outside of the creation.
Exactly. But if I add the word other and say he created all other things, I have grammatically forced Jesus into the category of created things. I've made him the first created item, who then makes the rest.
Oh, I see. So the argument is that the original Greek explicitly places Jesus completely outside of creation.
Yes. But of course, that brings us to the very next phrase in Colossians. He is called the firstborn of all creation.
Prototokos in Greek. And honestly, to our modern ears, firstborn just means the first one born. Chronologically, the oldest.
It does to us. But we have to ask how the ancient Near Eastern culture and the Old Testament used that word.
And it wasn't always about birth order, was it?
Not at all. Prototokos very often referred to rank, preeminence, or the right of inheritance.
Do we have a clear Old Testament example of that?
We have several. Look at Psalm 89.27. God is talking about King David, and he says, I will make him my firstborn, the highest of the kings of the earth.
But wait, David was the youngest son of Jesse. He was literally the last born in his family.
Exactly, and he certainly wasn't the chronologically first king on earth either. But God gave him the title of firstborn to show his absolute rank and sovereignty.
That's a great point. And doesn't God call the nation of Israel his firstborn in Exodus 4?
He does. Israel is my son, my firstborn, and Israel was definitely not the first nation to exist. Egypt and Babylon were much older.
So when Colossians calls Jesus the Prototokos, it's not handing us a stopwatch for his creation. It's declaring his absolute authority and rank over everything that was created.
Right. It's a title of supremacy. And that logic flows perfectly into Revelation 3.14, where Jesus is called the beginning of the creation by God.
The Greek word there is arch, right? And in English, beginning usually means the first item off the assembly line.
Sure. But arch is a really rich Greek word. It can mean origin, first cause, or the active source of something. Think of the English word architecture.
Oh, like the architect is the source of the building, not the first brick.
Exactly. And if we want to see how Revelation uses the word arch, we just have to look at chapter 21, verse 6. God the Father calls himself the Alpha and Omega, the beginning, the arch, and the end.
Wow. Okay, so if the Father calls himself the arch, nobody would ever argue that the Father was the first thing created.
Right. Everyone understands that when the Father is the arch, he is the source of everything.
So applying that exact same textual logic to Jesus in chapter 3 means he is the active origin of creation, not the first passive product of it.
Precisely. The context defines the word.
Okay, that clears up a lot. But let's tackle the giant one. John 3.1 sin. The only begotten Son.
Monogenes.
Right. For 20 years, I read begotten and thought, well, that implies a beginning. He was uniquely created by God directly.
It's a very common understanding.
But the source material brought up a cross-reference that completely blew my mind. Hebrews 11.17.
Yeah, that's the real turning point for understanding monogenes. What stood out to you there?
Well, Hebrews 11 talks about Abraham offering up Isaac, and it explicitly calls Isaac Abraham's only begotten son. It uses that exact same Greek word, monogenes.
Right.
But anyone who knows the book of Genesis knows Abraham already had Ishmael. Ishmael was literally his first begotten son.
And he had other sons later with Keturah.
Exactly. So Isaac was, chronologically and biologically, never the only son Abraham begot.
So if the inspired writer of Hebrews knew about Ishmael but still called Isaac the monogenes, what does that force the word to mean?
It can't possibly mean the only one birthed. It has to mean unique, one of a kind, or special and irreplaceable.
Isaac was the unique son of the promise. There was no one else like him.
So when we take that verified biblical definition of monogenes and apply it to Jesus in John 3.1 scene, the whole idea that it means only created just evaporates.
It does. It just means Jesus is absolutely unique. He's the one-of-a-kind son, sharing the Father's nature, completely distinct from any created angel or human.
That's powerful. Letting the Bible define its own terms changes everything.
It really does. But we should touch on one last classic text used to argue for a starting point, Proverbs chapter 8.
Where wisdom is personified.
Right. Proverbs says Jehovah produced wisdom as the beginning of his way. The Watchtower applies this directly to Jesus in his pre-human existence.
But the source video argues that if you literally map the personification of wisdom onto Jesus, it falls apart ethically and logically.
Yeah, and the ethical part is really striking. In Proverbs, personified wisdom explicitly says she only loves those who love her.
But Jesus told us to love our enemies. He literally prayed for the people executing him on the torture stake.
Right, so his actual character totally contradicts the poetic description of wisdom there.
And there's a rhetorical issue too. If wisdom in Proverbs 8 is a literal pre-existing Jesus, then who is prudence?
Exactly. Proverbs 8.2 says, I, wisdom, dwell together with prudence.
So is prudence another literal person in heaven? Like another specific angel?
It shows how quickly things get messy when you take a poetic, literary personification of God's attributes and try to turn it into a historical biography.
Yeah, it's just a poem about how God used his wisdom, not a literal history of Christ being created.
Exactly.
Man, when you look at all of this, whether you totally agree yet or just have a lot of new questions, one thing is completely undeniable.
What's that?
The original texts are so much deeper than any single modern translation can convey.
They really are. They force you to dig.
And if you're the kind of person who has dedicated decades to the truth, who prepares for meetings and field service, I know you appreciate this exact kind of deep scriptural analysis.
Because it's not about just accepting something new blindly,
No, it's about getting as close to the actual truth of the text as possible.
which takes real intellectual honesty. It takes courage to put long-held theological beliefs through the strict filter of the ancient Greek and Hebrew.
It does, and that leaves us with a pretty provocative thought to ponder on your own.
Let's hear it.
If translating a single Greek word like arsh as origin instead of first product, or realizing the word other in Colossians was added by translators, if just those grammar details completely shift how we understand the nature of Christ,
Yeah.
what other foundational doctrines might look completely different if we read them purely through the lens of the original ancient languages, rather than through our modern translated frameworks?
That is a profound question, something everyone has to research for themselves. Well, to help consolidate everything we've unpacked today, let's just do a quick rundown of the key takeaways from the text analysis. Titles of eternity. Jesus holds titles like Eternal Father and Alpha and Omega, which, in their ancient context, point to an uncreated divine nature, not just a promise of future life. The I am statement. By using ego eimi in John 8.58, Jesus wasn't just claiming to be older than Abraham, he was invoking the eternal name of God from Exodus 3.14, which is why the religious leaders tried to stone him, a shared nature. The Greek text of John indicates Jesus came out from the Father, meaning he shares the same uncreated divine substance, much like a child shares a parent's DNA, rather than being a newly created ambassador outside of creation. In Colossians 1, the word other doesn't exist in the Greek. Jesus created all things, logically placing him outside the category of created things, redefining terms. Prototokos, firstborn, indicates supreme rank and authority, not birth order. And Arda, beginning in Revelation 3.14, points to Jesus as the active origin or architect of creation, the unique son. Monogenes means absolutely unique or one of a kind. Hebrews 11 proves this by calling Isaac the monogenes. Even though Ishmael already existed, it doesn't mean only created.
The foundation of our faith shouldn't just be built on the concrete of modern interpretations. We have to dig down to the bedrock of the ancient texts.
And the deeper you dig, the clearer the picture becomes.
It really does. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the scriptures today.